in from. We've just activated the recording for this event, so we will go ahead and share that with folks after, so this information can be disseminated to a larger audience. So great to have everyone with us. I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. I'm going to first start with the co-authors of this report, Dr. James Daria and Anna Canning. James and Anna, tell us what was the impetus for this report? Why start this report? And tell us, big picture, what are the main findings?
Hi. Yes, such a pleasure to be with you all. Really happy to be here. So the impetus, from my side, and I think we'll both talk about our perspectives on this, but as Avery mentioned, I worked for many years as a watchdog of ethical certifications and really seeing over time the emerging trend of companies getting certified like mid-labor dispute, right? So you would have workers on strike, big uprisings or demands of companies, and then suddenly they're certified ethically. Fair Trade USA often was what I ended up seeing a lot. And so over and over again, we see these corporations point to certifiers for cover. And that happens again in this case. Back in 2015, there were farm workers strikes spanning the US-Mexico border, and a campaign that really gained traction, calling on people to boycott Driscoll's. And, today, what is it, 8 years and 2 ethical certifications later, workers still report widespread abuses. And, as somebody who cares deeply about human rights and people's well-being, that is a huge problem in and of itself. But I think also, it's an issue more broadly that certifications exist as this parallel structure kind of that sits alongside our legal systems. And, often they pitch themselves as a way to bridge the quote unquote global governance gap. Right. But I think they're also really increasingly being incorporated into our legal systems for corporate compliance. So, in the US, we see certifiers promoting themselves to corporations as a way to meet their ESG commitments. So to say that they're doing something about social issues to investors. And in Europe, we see the rise of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation coming together in some form. And with that, there is the real threat of entrenching these certifications and auditing into public policy. So it's not just an issue of, misleading consumers in the grocery store. It is really a privatization in many ways of our legislative structures that can potentially be happening here. So there's a huge need to look at certifications, right? And not just as labels, what they mean in the grocery store, but to evaluate the claims that they make about protecting human rights and to protect workers' fundamental rights. So that's really how James and I came to work together. That, if we want to evaluate the claims of how these certification schemes are working, it's really not enough to just look at the standards on paper. We need to hear about how they are impacting the people they claim to benefit. And I would really say, who better to do that intense field work than an anthropologist? So, James, I think that's your cue.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Dr. James Daria, and I am an anthropologist. I am currently the co-director of the Food Studies program at Spelman College. I have done extensive field work in San Quintín starting in 2016. My first visit to San Quintín was shortly after the farm worker strike in 2015. And I said, this is what I need to study. What's going on here? Why are these farm workers calling themselves slaves of the 21st century? So I lived in the Valley of San Quintín 1 year to do in-depth ethnographic research. That includes participant observation. It includes working in the fields. I've worked in the fields in San Quintín as a farm worker a couple of times. I've done over 200 semi-structured interviews lasting from 30 minutes to an hour and a half. And I've gone to San Quintín at least once every year since 2016, except during the COVID pandemic. I know the situation in the field. I know the workers and their complaints, their desires, their yearnings for justice, their hunger for justice. And so what I try to do, and I'm trying to do in this report, is to bring the voice of the workers to a general public. So what anthropologists we usually do, we write books and we write academic articles, but that's not really accessible to the majority of the population. And I think with this report, what I want to do, and what the farm workers of San Quintín have really asked me, is to bring their voices and the violations that are happening in the fields to a more general public so that people know what's going on. One of the things that separates anthropology, ethnography, qualitative research from something like a certifier arriving or a third-party auditor arriving is that all of my research has mostly been outside of the workplace. One of the things we have to realize is that pretty much all workplaces are violent spaces of violent hierarchies and inequalities. This is especially true if you're a farm worker, especially if you're a migrant farm worker, especially if your first language is in Spanish because you speak Triqui or Mixteco, if you're a woman, if you're Afro descent, if you're poor, right? So the fields of San Quintín are places that are riddled with violent hierarchies and inequalities. The conditions in which workers live and work are conditions of extreme precarity. Because of that, workers are scared. They're scared to denounce their employer. They're scared to denounce violations of Mexican labor law or social security law or, international human rights. And so what happens when a certifier or a third-party auditor comes is they ask questions at the workplace, in front of management, in front of the grower, in front of the foreman. And so what happens is that the workers tend to say, yes, everything's great here, everything's wonderful, I really like working here. And that ends it because they don't want to lose their job. Losing their job means that they might not eat, that they might not be able to buy water in a desert in order to drink or bathe their children. So what I do is I do all of my in-depth ethnographic research and qualitative interviewing outside of the workplace because workers are scared. I go into workers' homes where they're comfortable, where they're safe. I make sure that there's no foreman in the neighborhood because kinship networks extend from the workplace into farm worker communities. And I create safe spaces where workers are allowed to speak their truth. There have been instances, for example, where I've had to pick up workers in my car and drive to a very isolated and dark part of the side of the highway in order for them to feel safe to denounce their employer. And again, these employers are certified by the Equitable Food Initiative and by Fair Trade USA. There is not a safe space for workers to speak up, even with these certifications. And this is really horrible in the sense that the agro-export industry that's booming in Mexico now counts for more revenue inside of Mexico than petroleum, for example. It's just shy of migrant remittances. So the agro-export enclaves and the industries that are producing berries, but also other things, right, are creating an enormous amount of wealth for transnational corporations. But workers aren't seeing this. So if we look at agro-exports generally, this can include bread, it could also include avocados, it could also be tequila or beer. But the burgeoning berry and the produce industry in Mexico is one of the industries that are most important right now. If you're a transnational company, why would you not want to go across the border from California in the United States, what used to be part of Mexico, to Baja California, where you pay people $15 an hour in California. In Baja, you can pay them $15 a day. In Baja California, there are repressive company unions making sure that workers' wages are low, that they exist in these repressive conditions. And so why not? All of these industries are extractive. They're extracting the labor power from workers' hands. They're extracting the water from the desert, from the water table, from desalinating plants. And this water goes into the berries, and the berries are exported across the US-Mexican border. So we have all of this generation of wealth. Unfortunately, this wealth is not trickling down to the farm workers themselves, even with these certifications.
Thank you so much for that, Anna and James. I want to just be really clear for folks about exactly who, what, and where we're talking about. So I think we've situated the experience of agricultural workers in San Quintín within a broader context in which we've seen that ethical certifications often don't work for workers. So I want to be really clear about this example that we're talking about here. So remind us, we're talking about Mexico, Baja California, San Quintín. We're talking, the report highlights two plantations. So Rancho Nuevo Produce and Rancho Agrícola Santa Mónica. These are plantations that source to large companies, including Driscoll's, Andrew and Williamson Fresh Produce, and they're certified by EFI and Fair Trade USA. I want to just be clear before we move on, Anna and James, can you lay out exactly who we're talking about, what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a great job summing it up there, right? And that those are the big players in this report. And then do you want me to talk a little bit about like what the key findings were before to kind of set the framework for the details as we talk through them?
I think that'd be great. I think one thing I would love to highlight as well is maybe some of the retailers folks might be familiar with. So we don't need to forget about the Costco's of the world, right? When we're thinking about these issues.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, just to be clear within the purview of this report that we have named a couple of retailers, there is also some really excellent research out there. Matt Fisher-Daly, who's on this call right now, has really done some supply chain research linking these farms to specific retailers more broadly. I think one of the issues that we always see, or that we see in this a lot is, these things may be certified. There is still such a lack of transparency, really connecting the dots all the way through. But as we get into in the report, Costco definitely intimately involved in the development of EFI certification for their supply chains, one of the big markets. Also, I know that there are photos from James' fieldwork pointing to HEB supermarkets which I believe is big in Texas. And Driscoll's berries show up in just about every supermarket you walk into, both in the US and all over the world. So yeah, I mean, some of the key findings, I think, just to bring that back home, ethical certifications are really failing to address regulatory gaps, both through weak standards and then through failed enforcement. And we'll get into more of that. These certifications really help obscure the fundamentally exploitative dynamics of the agro-export industry that James was just talking about. That you can have something on one side of the border, people are making as much in an hour as workers are making in a day. And if you buy the one where labor is completely undervalued, that's what's sold as fair. That continues to be remarkable to me. I think that, some of the other findings then that we get into really are about power and how it works. So these certifications are part of what are called multi-stakeholder initiatives. We'll get into that in a bit, but they really help prop up corporate power and undermine worker organizing. And I think the mechanisms by which that happens is something that we spend a lot of time on in this report. Also, part of that structure, despite the rhetoric of continuous improvement that comes out from both Fair Trade USA and EFI, labor standards have actually gone down over time. Like since the launch of those certifications to when you look at the standards now, the key places they have gone down. And, all of this research is situated in kind of a broader set of research that's really happening in the business and human rights community at this time, pointing to how certification and the auditing model fails to protect workers' rights. I think that this research really builds on that and goes to show that these certification schemes help undermine worker organizing. And really, like, something isn't better than nothing in the case of these certifications. So those are some of the key findings, and I think how it fits into the broader conversation that's happening around business and human rights at this point.
Yeah, and if I can jump in real quick, there was a really good question in the chat. These when we think of fair trade, we often think of smallholders, for example, like small coffee farmers in the mountains that may own their own land, or it may be collective land, like communal lands or ejidos or whatever. But in these agro-export enclaves, we don't see that. These are small, medium, and large transnationalized plantations. They may be growers that are directly affiliated with distributors in the United States, or they may be subcontracted farms. But these are places where thousands, tens of thousands of migrant farm workers live and work. So smallholders are displaced from their communities in southern Mexico, and say Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guerrero, Veracruz, for example. They migrate either seasonally, temporarily, or they settle permanently in a place like San Quintín because of the economic crisis in their communities. So they sell their labor. They're no longer campesinos that work their own land. They're now jornaleros, which means that they sell their labor for these small, medium, and large plantations, and their products are exported throughout the world. So I think we have to kind of get rid of some of the ideology around these terms like fair trade, or what is a farm, for example. These are plantations connected transnationally.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Anna and James. And I think that last point that you mentioned, James, we have to think about fair trade differently. I think that's really sort of the a very important point, to look at fair trade with capital letters and the trademark versus what we might all want fair and equitable trade to be, right? And they're very different things. Anna, I wanted to just give the last word to you before I turn to Evelina, if you have anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So we'll move now to Evelina Ramirez Ruiz, who we're thrilled to have with us today. Again, Evelina is the Secretary General of the SINDHA Union. Evelina, I want to turn the floor to you. I want to hear from you about what are the conditions that farm workers in the San Quintín Valley are facing today? What are some of the challenges they face? And I'd like to hear in particular, if you're able to talk about challenges to independent worker organizing. So these company unions that we see dominate the space. And then of course, the work of SINDHA, which is the only independent union, though it's not formally recognized in the sector. Evelina, over to you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Muchas gracias, un placer. Definitivamente creo que el SINDHA es un sindicato único de jornaleros agrícolas independiente que está haciendo un trabajo constante para acompañar estas denuncias, como James lo mencionaba, que difícilmente de miles y miles de trabajadores son muy pocos aquellos que se atreven a hacer una llamada, a decir me está pasando esto. Y precisamente el trabajo que hemos realizado en estos 2 últimos años de acompañamiento y de asesoramiento a los trabajadores, especialmente de Rancho Nuevo y Santa Mónica, que han hecho en la temporada alta de la cosecha de los berries, los paros laborales por falta de un buen salario para los trabajadores. Entonces, pero no solamente es la falta de un salario digno, sino también es la forma de tratar a los trabajadores, especialmente estas empresas que van a contratar gente del sur de México para traerlos a sus campamentos. Entonces prácticamente están obligados a cumplir todas las reglas de la empresa. Dentro de ellos quisiera mencionar que hay trabajadores que nos han llamado donde les han retenido sus documentos oficiales, les retienen salario, también si se sienten mal de salud un día, ellos no tienen el derecho de descansar, pero si alguien se queda, entonces no tiene derecho de estar en su habitación. ¿Qué es lo que hace la empresa? Los sacan de la empresa, digo del campamento, y no tienen derecho a comida. Entonces, para nosotros ha sido inhumano este trato que le dan a los trabajadores. Entonces, nosotros hemos hecho un acompañamiento a las trabajadoras, a los trabajadores a denunciar en la Secretaría del Trabajo y Previsión Social, pero existe el temor en los trabajadores, el miedo que hay de perder su trabajo lejos de su tierra, lejos de la familia. Entonces ha sido bien difícil y cuando nosotros nos acercamos como sindicato independiente, pues aparecen los sindicatos charros, ¿no? Como la CTM, la CROM y la CRO, que son las empresas los sindicatos que las empresas tienen, y entonces para nosotros es muy difícil acompañar a los trabajadores cuando la empresa dice, este trabajador tiene un sindicato que lo respalda y que lo defiende, entre comillas, porque no hay ninguna defensa, ningún asesoramiento, ningún acompañamiento con respecto a estos trabajadores. A nosotros nos ha tocado acompañar a mujeres que están fuera de su habitación, sentadas esperando que llegue a las 6 de la tarde para que los dejen ingresar a su habitación. Para nosotros eso es inhumano. No debe de existir, porque a pesar de que les descuentan los alimentos, les descuentan la habitación, pues aún así no tienen derecho a estar en ella por lo menos un día de descanso. Y para mí, ahora que en México se quiere implementar las 40 horas de labores a la semana, pues va a ser peor, porque entonces no, si no descansan un día, ahora menos van a descansar dos. Para nosotros estos son retos que tenemos que animar a los y a las trabajadoras a poner una denuncia formal ante la autoridad. Esto ayuda un poco para que llegue la inspección de la Secretaría del Trabajo a las empresas, pero no es un todo, no es un todo, es muy complicado. Ahora, ¿qué necesitamos nosotros que cambie? ¿Qué queremos lograr? Pues que exista la libertad sindical, que no obliguen a los trabajadores a pertenecer a estos sindicatos que no los representan y que dejen que los trabajadores elijan o formen a un sindicato independiente real de trabajadores para que defiendan sus derechos como se debe de hacer. Ahora, quisiera mencionar un poco acerca de las certificadoras. Realmente en estas empresas como es Santa Mónica y Rancho Nuevo y otras, que existen esas certificadoras del EFI, cuando se habla que va libre de explotación laboral, para nosotros eso es como una pantalla que cubre toda la esclavitud que existe dentro de los centros de trabajo, porque para nosotros es igual que los sindicatos charros. Los sindicatos están supuestamente para defender a los trabajadores, pero no lo hacen. Las certificadoras vienen nada más a certificar, pero no se cercioran, no se hace una investigación a fondo, que si realmente el producto va libre de explotación laboral, si los trabajadores están recibiendo un trato digno. Hay una trabajadora que me dijo, aunque no me paguen mucho, pero quiero que me traten como un ser humano. Solamente los trabajadores lo que piden es un buen trato. Nosotros no, nosotros peleamos por un salario digno y por un trato digno, que así como vale el patrón y la empresa, valen los trabajadores y merecen pues un trato de humanos, ¿no? Entonces, para nosotros, ¿qué es lo que quisiera que cambiara? Que en México existiera la libertad sindical para lograr la justicia laboral que tanto hemos peleado, que tanto hemos luchado. Esperamos que realmente cambie la forma de certificar este producto y que no se siga solamente haciendo una simulación, una pantalla muy superficial, cuando en realidad los que están ahora sí pagando un precio alto de esclavitud moderna son los verdaderos trabajadores que levantan la cosecha día con día. Entonces, para mí, los obstáculos son grandes, el trabajo es mucho, pero para mí es importante que sigamos trabajando para quitar este trabajo esclavo, la contratación informal, la forma de lo que le llamamos el outsourcing, que no exista, que se elimine para que los trabajadores y las trabajadoras puedan tener un trato digno como se merecen. Para nosotros, como sindicato independiente, es seguir trabajando, seguir asesorando, seguir apoyando, informando a los trabajadores y a las trabajadoras por todos los medios para que sepan que hay derechos que tenemos que defender, pero creo que por el otro lado sería importante avanzar en exigir que estas certificadoras o que existan o que no existan realmente, porque en realidad esto solamente beneficia a la empresa y nunca al trabajador.
Thank you very much, Abelina, for that presentation. Before we move back to the co-authors of the report, Abelina, I wanted to ask you about a specific egregious instance of labor abuses in the San Quintín Valley, in which I understand Sindha was involved in investigating. So this is an instance at the Rancho Agrícola Santa Mónica that is mentioned in the report, where there were indicators of forced labor that were found in August of last year. And as the co-authors report, after Sindha had asked local authorities to investigate, nothing was done until the US, I think it was a consular general, came to visit, accompanied by you and Sindha. So I wanted to hear about that case where folks' documents had been confiscated, where their pay had been withheld. Wanted to hear about that case and why you think that there was no action until there was some international attention on this issue. And I should mention for our audience that this farm where these indicators of forced labor were found produces products that are certified by both. Some are Equitable Food Initiative certified and some are Fair Trade USA certified. So Abelina, I'd love to hear from you about what happened in August of last year in that case, if you could share a little bit.
Bueno, cuando nosotros asistimos, definitivamente hablamos con el dueño de esta plantación y él aceptaba que definitivamente él contrataba gente para trabajar, no para descansar. Contrataba gente que cumpliera con el contrato. Él puso argumentos que es por eso que retenía los documentos para que las personas obligatoriamente se quedaran a cumplir sus 6 meses a laborar. Él aceptó que realmente le retenía salario, que les retenía los documentos, que sí los llevaba al parque el día que no asistieran a trabajar, porque él no quería gente solamente para descansar, él quería gente para cumplir y por eso él invertía tanto dinero en ir por ellos a su estado natal para traerlos a Baja California y trabajar. Definitivamente a nosotros eso no fue una razón justificada para el trato que se le daba a las personas. Entonces, desde ahí, inclusive, disminuyó las llamadas telefónicas para nosotros de los abusos que se hacían dentro de esa empresa, y también la Secretaría del Trabajo hizo una inspección a nivel estatal, pero está pendiente la inspección a nivel federal para esta empresa. Tengo entendido que le va a llegar una sanción a esta empresa por esos abusos que ya están, pero eso es solamente algo que Secretaría del Trabajo nos notificó que sí le va a llegar, mas no estoy segura que ya le haya llegado. Eso ayuda un poco, pero eso tampoco no nos garantiza que las cosas están muy bien en ese campamento. De hecho, tenemos más denuncias de otras empresas ahora donde están habiendo abusos y descuentos de su salario por la vivienda, por la comida. Es un engaño. Es un engaño porque cuando van por ellos a su pueblo, les dicen que no les van a descontar vivienda, que no les van a descontar alimentos, pero pues nosotros ahorita ya tenemos las pruebas de las deducciones de vivienda y comida, y cómo es un engaño, y ya, pues digo, todos los seres humanos tenemos derecho a descansar un día, pero para ellos eso no, los 6 meses no tienes derecho a descansar un día, por eso es que te sacan de tu habitación y entras hasta las 6 de la tarde. Digo, ni siquiera el horario de que regresen los trabajadores, que es a las 4 de la tarde. No regresan ellos de fuera, sino entran hasta las 6 como un castigo. Entonces, para nosotros es importante darle seguimiento a estas denuncias y ver qué procede, que si en este año les llega la sanción a estas empresas o no les va a llegar.
Thank you so much, Evelina. I think that, okay, here we go. Just checking interpretation is on the correct channel. I think we're good. Thank you so much, Evelina, for telling us a little bit about that specific case. I want to turn now back to the report co-authors, Anna and James, to tell us a little bit more in detail. So how do these certification schemes operate in San Quintín? And how can it be possible for a case like how Avelina is describing? How can a farm like, or a ranch like Santa Monica actually have products that are certified by EFI and Fair Trade USA? So Anna and James, I'll turn it to you now to tell us how you see this playing out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I always like to go back to the sort of origins of things and start at the beginning as far as like, well, how did we get here, right? And, you know, just give a little function or a little introduction to folks about how certification works, because I think often we know it as little labels in the grocery store, but there's like an entire structure behind it. So, you know, certifications are really all over the place now. I feel like every time I go to the store, there's like a certified new, I don't even know what, something. But they actually came about really recently in the evolution of things. So, you know, back in the 90s, there were these big revelations of Nike sweatshops, right? And student activists and others were really putting pressure on Nike to clean up their supply chains. And I think that that's really like the origins of this kind of concept of corporate social responsibility that we see now. And, you know, it's a digression, right? Like, how did we get to that moment of crisis in the 90s? You know, Nike started off as the leader of offshoring their manufacturing. So when they started out in the 60s, just 4% of US footwear was imported. Now it's something like 98%. And what was driving that? I mean, I think the themes are so common to what we're hearing here is cost-cutting measures, right? So subcontracting to places with lower and lower and lower wages, lower rates of unionization, squeezing factory owners to continually do more with less. And, you know, surprise, after 3 decades of that, Nike's Nike's practices were revealed, and it turns out all of those things lead to really bad conditions. So I think that as we talk about these certifiers, we need to keep remembering that it is the company purchasing practices that are really helping to drive this exploitation. So, there we see the rise of corporate social responsibility. And I think that DNA really informs what we see today, which is, it got taken up as a marketing goal. And I think that the goal really being like getting activists off companies' backs, as opposed to changing what are ultimately very profitable and beneficial conditions for companies. And I think it came up before, right? Like fair trade as a concept started out with small scale farmers, started out in coffee, which is actually where my origins are. But, it's really expanded since then. And about a decade ago, there was actually a huge controversy within fair trade in the US around that move to go from certifying small scale farmers to also bringing plantations like we're talking about today into the mix. And so once again, I think we are seeing, things that people were calling out as, these are the potential consequences. I think we are seeing those consequences come home to roost here. So yeah, corporate social responsibility, right? Like that cycle of shock and public relations response, I think is really built into the model that we see, and we should keep that in mind. How certifications work in a nutshell, so certification is like, there's the label that goes on the package, and that label shows this product in this particular box has met those standards, or some portion of that product, supposedly. There are then, behind those standards, there are what are called multi-stakeholder initiatives, usually, or in the cases of EFI and Fair Trade USA, that's definitely what we're talking about today. And so the concept there sounds really good on paper, right? Like you get a bunch of different stakeholders together to weigh in on what standards should be. You get companies, you get suppliers, you get the brands at the ends of the supply chain, you get some NGOs who work on some related issues, all to weigh in. But what that means is you've got all of these voices weighing in on, in this case, what the standards of work and living should be for workers. But workers don't have a voice in it. Like, is Sindha involved in setting the standards that apply on these certified farms? No, they're not. And that, or if there is a token worker group at the table, they are then often outnumbered by the other parties. Or, outgunned, honestly. Like, you will have very sophisticated, like, PR professionals sitting there next to somebody who organizes workers. Who's going to win, right? Anyhow, so I think that this whole structure, though, really obscures who the rights holders are in this conversation about workers and standards. So, all right, we have standards exist, and then the next step is auditors. So their job is to go out to the fields, take these standards, and basically, run down a checklist to ensure compliance. And we'll talk more about how that actually ends up working. But it is an entire industry in itself. I was looking at the numbers the other day, and it is in the billions. It is growing. And yeah, I think auditors really sell themselves often as being a neutral third party. I really think that we need to be thinking about that as another business interest in this entire agro-export field. And I think that brings me to, we need to talk for a minute about where the money goes in all of this, right? So certifiers, the ones who set the standards, then charge brands licensing fees to put the logos that you see onto products. So they have an interest in having as many, or their sticker on as much stuff as possible, really. Suppliers, in this case, the plantations, pay auditing fees to auditors. And, you go to, for example, SCS Global, one of the auditors that we talk about in this report, you go to their website and they talk a lot about how they are a neutral third party that evaluates things. But, there's actually research out there that really shows that this model where suppliers pay auditors actually creates a conflict of interest in that moment where you have that auditor on that farm. And we do get into that some more in the report. And so, I think what you see really when you look at this whole system of certification is that we really see at every step, the system is not set up to incentivize human rights in any way. And so that's the theory, behind the whole thing. I think we're going to talk then a little bit about, how that ends up playing out in the fields. And we're going to do that by talking about kind of 3 critical elements that these certifications talk about that makes their programs work. And one is going to be, fair trade committees, leadership teams, different standards, call them different things. They function similarly. The other is premiums. Both of these programs rely on what's called a premium, a little bit of extra money, ultimately, that brands that have those labels pay for those certified products. And that gets used to make sort of social claims, development claims around what's happening. And then we'll get more into auditing and ultimately why it doesn't work, how you have those cases like Avelina was just talking about. So that's the landscape we're about to dive into. And so fair trade committees, leadership teams, what are they? What do they do? Like I was saying, standards have different names for what these committees are. But these committees are really central to their claims that they empower, that certifications empower workers. So in fair trade programs, they're called fair trade committees. One of the responsibilities of those committees is deciding how that premium fund that I was just mentioning gets spent. In EFI, Equitable Food Initiative, they refer to them as the leadership team. In both cases, these committees have rules around how they're made up. So generally, a sample of workers and management. If you are looking at, academic research or whatever on these things, they often refer to them as joint body committees because of that, because it's some workers, some management coming together to decide things. And then often those committees function as a first line of reporting grievances under these programs for workers. So if you have a problem with your boss or you are, experiencing gender-based violence on the job, go to this committee to get that problem addressed. And I think we'll talk more, James is going to talk about how that works in practice. But I think it's, while we're still talking about the standards side of things, I think it's also really useful to note that, all of this stuff that you would know you could, say, raise a grievance about would come through, if nothing else, the trainings that these standards talk about. But when you look at the standards for the trainings that workers are supposed to get, the emphasis in the standards is on training people to the certification standards, to the supposed rights that they have under the certification, instead of training them on their legal rights. And that is a huge issue in this case, especially because Mexican labor law is, in a lot of cases, stronger and a higher bar for wages, breaks, all of these things than these standards that we're talking about. So workers are at great risk of learning that they have lesser rights than they actually have, if they even actually receive the trainings that they're supposed to receive. So I think, that's like some of the landscape there. And, in general, when certifications, MSIs are promoting this work that they do, they talk about these committees as a substitute for having a worker organization, a union like Sindha, that has a collective bargaining agreement. And they talk about them filling the gaps, that could exist. But that is really not the function that these committees are filling. So James, do you want to talk some about how that actually is working?
Sure. So what I tried to do was test this theory of fair trade and equitable food through worker interviews. So one of the things I've done is to be able to compile dozens of interviews of workers who have been on the Fair Trade Committee or the leadership team, these joint body structures, as well as workers who've tried to make complaints to the leadership team. And if we take the case of Rancho Nuevo, for example, what we see is that the violent hierarchies that exist on the farm are not able to be reformed through this leadership team, through the joint body committee. Why? If we look at the makeup at one place in time, when I did my research, the makeup of the leadership team included foremen, mayordomos, and those foremen have a really bad reputation for abusing workers. As well, there is a direct descendant, the son of the grower, who's an engineer on the plantation, on the leadership team as well. So we see that these imbalances of power that exist between growers, management, foremen, and workers are simply reproduced in these joint body committees. And what does that do? It creates then a space of further retaliation. There is no safety or security for a field worker to go to the leadership team and denounce some kind of health and safety violation or some kind of labor rights abuse. So what happens is that these instances are not an alternative to collective bargaining agreements, a grievance procedure with an independent union, and these are basically functioning just like the company protection unions, the yellow unions that exist on these farms. I mean, if you have a union on the farm, you have the CROC, you have the CROM, you have the CTM, all of these crony charro unions, why would you, like, if they actually worked, why would you need a leadership team anyway? Why would you need a fair trade program? Why would you need an equitable food initiative? And so what happens is that we have two spaces of worker repression and retaliation at work. We have the crony union, and then we have the leadership team. So I document numerous cases where workers have tried to work within the system, within the leadership team, denounce abuses, and they are unable to change the exploitive and violent hierarchies that exist in farm labor. This is not a substitute. And unfortunately, it just reproduces those hierarchies.
Thank you both, Anna and James. I wanted James to see if you could tell us a couple of examples of that instance in which you mentioned that folks have tried to work within the system. So I think in the report you have the example of Lucinda, a pseudonym, who's tried to join one of these joint bodies. Can you tell us about her experience? And I think there's another one or two folks that you mentioned in the report who've tried to be part of the leadership team or these joint body committees, and for various reasons they've had to exit to sort of keep their integrity. So I wonder if you could speak to a couple of those examples mentioned in the report.
Sure. Lucinda is a really good example because she's a woman, and a lot of these programs try to create this kind of gender parity or safety for women to speak up and denounce abuses. But one of the things that Lucinda found when she became a member of the leadership team is that the hierarchies that exist within the farm are reproduced in the leadership team, and there's her direct foreman above her on the leadership team. So she tried to, for example, denounce abuses. For example, her mayordomo, her foreman, fired this field worker because he wanted to leave after 8 hours a day. He didn't want to work force overtime because he had to go to the hospital. Whatever he had in his personal life, he didn't want to work obligatorily forced overtime that day. So he was fired by his foreman. Lucinda tries to take this issue back to the leadership team, but that same foreman is on the leadership team. How is she going to denounce the abuses from her mayordomo, her foreman, if the foreman is on the leadership team? She tried to bring it up, and the foreman says, if you're here to work, then you work, right? If you're not happy about working, then, take your badge, leave your boxes, and hit the road. That's usually the response of most of the people on these leadership teams. And we're going to talk about another concrete example in auditing and how this kind of retaliation, repression, and fear that exists on the leadership team is reproduced during the auditing process. But we see the same thing at Santa Monica, where, the strikes broke out, where this instance of forced labor. There's no way that workers, especially field workers, can denounce these abuses within the leadership team and have any ounce of justice on the job.
And I'll turn it back to you if you want to continue talking about auditing or premiums and those other pieces of this bigger picture.
Yeah, definitely. So, I think another big claim that both of these certifications make in different ways is that, there is a little bit of extra money, this premium, a social premium that goes from the buyers to workers, and there's a lot of claims around empowerment and social development and all of that goes with those. Like I was mentioning, I think a little bit before, the way that those premiums are administered is different. Fair Trade USA, the premiums are administered by the Fair Trade Committee. So that body then votes. The funds go to collective projects. And, I think in this report, there are, pictures of like some of the water tanks that come up. Then the EFI bonus goes to workers in their checks. And I think I was mentioning before that this is another really interesting place where the MSI, the multi-stakeholder initiative process, plays out over time, is that over the time that EFI has been around, the way that those premiums are calculated has changed, that those premiums have gone down. There actually used to be a premium for organic berries. There is not anymore, which is fascinating because you go to Costco. Last summer, I was looking at them, and I think organic berries are still $2 a little clamshell more than conventional ones. Workers definitely are not seeing that benefit. So, and finally, I think this is an issue across a lot of certified products, but these premiums are talked about as a social development tool and all of this, that it's like something extra workers get for their work. But there ends up being a huge contradiction there, right? Because consumer choice is supposed to be the economic lever that makes this whole system work. There is then a lot of emphasis in certified products about the quality of the product, right? Like, oh, you taste this coffee and it is better because of all of these things, and you can feel good drinking it. Or, in the case of EFI, there's a lot of claims around food safety accompanying the labor claims. And actually, I think James will talk about this, that, most of the testimony, like workers mostly think about it as a food safety program, not a labor rights program, that is how it shows up in their work. But, every time you push on quality, what you're really pushing is more work for the people making that product. Like, somebody has to take the time to select the ripest berries. So, you're picking, and you get paid by the berry you pick, or by the pound you pick, not by the quality of the berry you pick. Or there's actually quality, never mind. How you actually get paid for berries is incredibly complicated. There are deep tables in the report for that. But basically, you are adding a layer of work by raising these quality standards, raising these food safety standards. And what the report gets into in great depth is how these premiums really do not account for that additional work. It's that in the report, there's a quote from a farm worker who lays out the whole system really clearly. And in the end says, for me, fair trade means unfair trade. And so in that way, we really see that these certifications are not addressing the fundamental issue of undervalued agricultural labor that underpins all of this. So James, I think you want to talk some about specific examples of just how these premiums work in an environment of rampant wage theft, et cetera.
Sure. So these premiums usually only work for harvested products. So that doesn't include the time of planting and pruning and all of those things, right? So what happens is that a farm worker under the EFI program or under the Fair Trade USA program is basically doing 3 jobs now. They're picking, they're sorting, which has to do with quality control, and they're packing into clamshells and then into large boxes. And these workers are paid per box, how many boxes a day that don't get rejected in the quality control table, for example, how many boxes they can earn. And so basically, they're doing the job of 3 people. Previously in agriculture, even in these kind of berry industries, or most people just picked by the bucket, for example, or by the box. And then there were sorters and there were packers. But what FE has done is to sort of certify as equitable this accumulation of labor power and the kind of time and the speed and the intelligence necessary, because farm labor is a very, very detailed and qualified form of labor, right? It is not something that anybody can do. But what happens is that workers only get a small portion of their labor through premiums. So if we look at EFI, for example, what happens is that they get maybe 200 pesos here and there. The workers don't know how the transparency works. They don't know where this money is coming from or why. They consider EFI as a company from the United States that gives bonuses, for example. And the other thing they're doing is that there's so much rampant wage theft, like violations of Mexican law, especially in overtime and Sunday pay and Sunday and holiday premiums. You know, holidays, they usually don't get off on holiday. The overtime pay is so low because these company protection unions that are getting paid by the employer are the ones setting the price for piece rate. And so what happens is that the harvest, especially in the horticultural interest or sector, the harvest is where the corporation is going to make most of its money. But its major cost is labor. So if you can figure out how to reduce labor, you increase the profit for the harvest. And so by incrementing the amount of work in these programs, combining picking, packing, and sorting, doing all of this by piece rate, what happens is that the corporations are making tons of money, but the workers are only getting this occasional bonus. But many of the workers don't know their labor rights because the EFI does not teach them Mexican labor law. So what happens is that they're getting this occasional bonus, and the workers really like this bonus because, you know, it's a little bit of extra income. What they don't realize is all of the wage theft involved, and that this premium is not offsetting the amount of wages stolen from them, or what they could be earning with a good collective bargaining agreement that regulates piece rate pay, for example. So most of the workers consider these premiums as tapándole el ojo al macho, which basically means putting blinders on the mule. In order to get workers, or to keep workers from rising up and going on strike, as I detail in Santa Monica, maybe we can just give them a little handout, this little bonus, this little premium. So that way, you know, although we're exploiting them, we can give them a little bit more money, and that way they're content. That way, you know, they don't go on strike. That way they don't form a union. That way they don't bring grievances up, for example. And so really, the bonus is not really offsetting the amount of exploitation and wage theft that is systemic to this industry in Mexico.
I think those are really important points, and I don't think can be overstated. I think, again, going back to one of Anna's points earlier, that is honestly one of my favorite parts of the report. It's the standards that are laid out directly against these private standards, directly against Mexican labor law and international standards. It's on pages 17 and 18 of the report. And you see just how low these certification standards are. And you're right, James. I mean, thinking about piece rate or not tying a minimum wage requirement to the legal minimum wage, that's really seems to be one of the root causes of these continued abuses. Anna, back to you. I think we need to cover auditing as the last piece of this puzzle.
Yeah. And fortunately, I think I've already sort of given you like the big hand waving version of auditing. So, you know, we can just set this up really quickly. Right. Auditing exists to confirm compliance, or is supposed to confirm compliance with the standards that are on paper. And, you know, talked about suppliers paying for audits. It's definitely a situation in which you get what you pay for. We see that across this industry for sure. And, you know, an auditor generally flies in for like a couple of days is maybe the duration of an audit. One of the things I was really struck by looking at, you know, that as James has done his field work, is like the span of work sites, and I think he's going to talk about that some, but that several days is That's a tall order to cover that comprehensively. And so, auditors will interview a sampling of workers. The methodology for that differs by standards. We do get into that some in the report. Exactly what that sample size is depends on the audit guidance. Some of those documents actually aren't public, but, I've seen guidance in general that prescribes interviews to be like the square root of the number of workers, which is confusing. And I always have to look that up, but that means that for like 100 workers, you could interview just like 3 workers is the square root there. So yeah, James, do you want to talk more about auditing and how it works in function in practice?
Sure. I think we can go back to the case of Lucinda, for example. So if the leadership team, the Joint Body Committee is a space where workers are not free to denounce abuses, what happens when an auditor comes in? So maybe SCS Global Services or Elevate or somebody will fly in. The workers never know who they are, but they fly in and they go into the human resources department of the growers, the plantations facility, and they convoke a meeting of the EFI people. So Lucinda, for example, was convoked to go to this meeting. And the auditor comes in, and of course, she doesn't know who these people are. She just thinks of EFI as being a company from the United States. And so the EFI auditor, whoever that may be, comes in and says, okay, were there any workplace violations? Did anybody get hurt? Has pesticide safety been maintained according to the standards? And what Lucinda talks about, and I detail this in my report, is that she just kind of shakes her head and says, yes, everything's great. No, everything's perfect. Why? Because her foreman is on the committee. And if she brings up abuses, her foreman's going to fire her right after that meeting. The human resources people are at that meeting, the growers at this meeting. There are very few field workers whatsoever at this meeting. And so what we see is this kind of coaching involved, that the hierarchies in the farm kind of forced workers to lie. And she says it, I think we tell lies. And, auditing is kind of this coaching. So there aren't any violations, are there? And the farm worker looks around and looks at her foreman. And she said, of course not. No, and my foreman is, a great guy and everything's wonderful, right? So we can see how these processes that create supposedly a more equitable food system or a fairer trade program, they're really, really overridden by the violent hierarchies of the workplace. And it's ethnography that can really get at what's happening in these spaces. And that's what I try to do as an anthropologist. And so, the other case is when I detail the case of forced labor at Santa Monica, there's no way that an auditor is going to be able to fly in for 2 days and then truly find out if there is forced labor going on. One of the things is that, even the Mexican state, the Mexican government, the Labor Department has certifications that certify plantations as child-free. But what happens? If there are children or young people working on the farm, usually the state government announces their audits. And so they come, and what happens? What the workers say is that los patrones limpian los campos, that the growers clean up the fields for the audit. And then as soon as the audit's over, they bring the young people back, the underage workers back to keep picking or whatever. And if this happens with government inspectors, why would this not happen with private inspectors that are paid for by these certification schemes, right? So I see it as completely impossible for a certifier to be able to find Pablo, for example. I was able to find Pablo because I've lived in this community. I lived for 6 months in Lázaro Cárdenas, and a worker leader basically just happened by all of these workers who were living in these horrid conditions. And we started doing interviews. And then we found out all these connections, and that unfolds in the report. But the kind of research that's needed to find cases of forced labor are not going to happen under auditing. They might happen under anthropology, under ethnography, under long-term detailed research, but auditing is not a solution to that. And so, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Oh, go ahead, Anna.
Oh, I was just going to add on to that. I think that the other thing, more anthropology, definitely, but also bringing it back to the situation that we have at hand. We have an independent worker organization, which is really a body through which workers are able to protect their own rights. And that is really the issue at hand here, is that we've talked about all of the power dynamics that fit into this certification scheme, right? And who has a vested interest in protecting their own rights? It's not the certifiers, it's not the auditors, it's workers. So I think that there needs to be, that is a context that we need to keep for all of this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. And just to hone in that point a little bit more, I was really struck by this quote on page 28 of the report, in which Elevate, which is one of the auditors that's used by Equitable Food Initiative, has said in other contexts where it's faced criticisms, they say themselves, so this social auditor says, social audits are not designed to capture sensitive labor and human rights violations, such as forced labor and harassment. So I think, you know, hear it there from Elevate. I think that sort of speaks for itself. Anna and James, I want to thank you so much for going through those different pieces of the puzzle here. Before we move on to questions from the audience, I want to give each of the panelists just a couple of minutes to speak about where do we go from here? What's the most important thing from each of your perspectives that you want to see change? What are our next steps? Avelina, I want to start with you. You spoke to this a little bit earlier, speaking about freedom of association, the right to have a union. I want to turn it back to you to speak a little bit more about what do you want to see happen in San Quintín.
Bueno, a partir del 2019 que se implementó la nueva reforma laboral de acerca de la libertad sindical y la oportunidad que nos dieron de que las empresas tenían que legitimar los contratos, definitivamente hay varias empresas. Nosotros estamos en ese proceso de identificar qué empresas no legitimaron, para nosotros como sindicato independiente poder meter la carta de representatividad y poder lograr contratos colectivos auténticos que garanticen los derechos laborales de las y los trabajadores. La otra es crear la visión amplia que tenemos como sindicato independiente, es que haya sindicatos en diferentes áreas de trabajo. Por ejemplo, hablando de los choferes que transportan el producto a los cuartos fríos o a los traileros que van y llevan el fruto a la frontera, que tengan un sindicato de su rama. O también los fumigadores, los regadores, todas estas áreas que a nosotros se nos hace muy difícil cubrir por la gran cantidad de empresas que hay y por la gran cantidad de trabajadores. Creo yo que para un sindicato poder cubrir toda esa parte es muy complicado, es muy difícil, y creo yo que los contratos colectivos de trabajo pueden ayudar un poco, pero seguramente lo que estaremos haciendo es vigilando, que eso es lo que hemos estado haciendo, vigilando que la autoridad correspondiente pueda hacer su trabajo. Y si no lo hace, nosotros lo denunciamos públicamente. Nosotros hemos llevado un proceso de acompañamiento, de asesoramiento, de talleres, de capacitación a hombres y mujeres, donde les animamos a perder el miedo, a organizarnos, a trabajar juntos, a quitarnos la idea equivocada como trabajadores que el sindicato puede resolver todos mis problemas, que si un trabajador busca un sindicato es porque le va a resolver todos los problemas, y no es así. Nosotros estamos implementando cada vez más intenso los talleres de información de derechos laborales, de sindicalismo, de organización, de unidad, de estar bien organizados, donde hemos hablado acerca de cómo las empresas sí están bien organizados y planean muy bien cómo explotarnos, cómo sacar más grandes ganancias a través de nuestro trabajo. Entonces, yo le hemos apostado más bien a los talleres de capacitación, a la organización y todo eso, y creo yo que a través de eso, claro, no va a ser de la noche a la mañana, quizás a nosotros muchas cosas no los vamos a poder ver, pero hemos visto el crecimiento que ha tenido el despertar de la gente a partir del 2015 a 2023. Ha habido un gran despertar de las y los trabajadores. Secretaría del Trabajo me ha informado que hay una gran cantidad de denuncias que años atrás no había. Entonces hoy hay un gran despertar de las y los trabajadores, y creemos que cada día va a ser más, y creemos que va a disminuir este abuso laboral, esta forma de tratar a los trabajadores. Entonces yo con eso me quedaría, que yo le apuesto a la organización, a la capacitación y a organizar a los trabajadores, y sobre todo a las mujeres que son las que luchan cada día por sus familias, por sacar adelante su casa, su familia. Pues yo le apuesto al liderazgo de las mujeres.
Thank you, Evelina. And we're really inspired by Cinta's leadership in this space. So thank you for all the work that you do. James, what about you? What do you think we need to see next?
Yeah, thank you. I'm putting in the chat, let's see if it works, a link to one of my recent articles about the failure of labor reform in Mexico that Evelina is talking about. I see the labor reform as being failed in the sense that it's legitimating illegitimate company protection unions in Mexico. And we see this in San Quintín all over. And so what is the larger context of this? And I think we need to put the interest of labor within the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, the successor of NAFTA, for example. One of the things that we have in other industries, like automobiles, aerospace and manufacturing, is this thing called the rapid response mechanism. This is put in under the renegotiation of the USMCA in order for workers to be able to alert people in the United States and Canada, the Mexican, US, and Canadian government, when there's a violation of labor rights in their workplace. But unfortunately, agriculture does not exist within the rapid response mechanism. And why? Why is it that manufacturing unions or the steel workers or the auto, the auto plant worker unions in the United States and Canada are looking out for Mexican workers in their same sector across these commodity chains? Where are the farm labor organizations and unions in the United States? Why are they not making direct links with Mexican unions in the countryside with farm workers and putting their policies into policy in the US government? Well, if we look at EFI, what we realize is that most of the farm worker organizations and unions in the United States are basically in EFI and really allegados al patrón, right? Pretty much really close to the grower. There are no real direct contacts and communication between US farm worker organizations and Mexican farm worker organizations in the United States. Why doesn't that exist? We need to unite workers and consumers across Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and create spaces of dialogue and of solidarity. And we need to implement labor reforms in the countryside in Mexico through the USMCA. And if these US-based farm worker organizations and union could actually do their part in terms of creating policy and pushing policy in Washington, we might be able to get the Mexican countryside, Mexican farm workers, that industry, into the rapid response mechanism of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. But the countryside is completely outside of this. So, I mean, I really want to question, where is our solidarity? Where is our solidarity as consumers of these products? How are we not going to open up conversation with the workers that pick the food that we eat? Where are our unions? Where are our leaders? Where are our politicians in all of this? So I think that, Abelina is correct. We need local organizing in spaces like San Quintín. We need farm worker organizing nationally in Mexico. Now there's a union that can do that. But also here in the United States, what do we need? We need greater solidarity. We need greater conversation. Unfortunately, there's this colonial relationship that still exists between the United States and Mexico. That's why we're not hearing the voices of Mexican workers. Mexican workers cannot cross the US-Mexican border to come to the United States and have a conversation with you. But farm worker jobs can go from California to Mexico because they pay low wages, right? Or for example, your strawberries can come from Mexico to your dinner table, but Mexican workers can't sit at that table with you. And so one of the things, we need greater solidarity. We need to, lower the kind of the systems of control and administration of these global commodity chains. And we need to put the voices of workers first and foremost.
Thank you, James, for that call for international solidarity. There is one bright spot in the report that mentions the Boycott Driscoll's campaign, where we have workers in Washington State being connected with folks in Baja California, and we definitely need to see more of that. Anna, finally over to you. What do you think we need to see? What are next steps here?
Yeah, so next steps. I mean, the obvious first step that could happen immediately, certifiers need to stop certifying suppliers with known labor rights abuses. That feels like absolutely the bottom, lowest basement wish that one could have. And certifiers and brands need to be held accountable for abuses in supply chains. This whole 90s vibe of being surprised when these things happen, that doesn't cut it anymore. We need to move on beyond that to corporations proactively taking responsibility for places that they know are high risk of these abuses happening. And, we have more recommendations in the report, for both brands and certifiers that they can take as concrete next steps. But, I think more broadly, case studies like this give us some very critical information, right? The fact that these certifications exist tells us something really important. The vast majority of our food, farming, manufacturing, and trade systems are designed to work in a way that most of us don't support. We know that unfair, unethical, poisonous practices are the norms. And these labels exist to try to tell us that this one thing is better than the rest, right? So there is, I think, an innate desire in a whole lot of people out there for something better. And, Avery, you were just pointing to the Driscoll's boycott as an example of that will for change. And, we see now across the US, the labor movement really having a moment of people organizing in their workplaces and standing up. And I think that those are all really places that we can support. That the research in this report shows us just how intertwined these corporate structures are across borders, and our organizing needs to match that. In my day job, one of the campaigns that we work with is the Pay Your Workers campaign. And that is a global campaign, came out of actually the moment in the COVID pandemic when fashion brands decided to just pull their orders and leave global garment workers in the lurch. And so that's a global campaign aligned around the demands of worker unions around the world, making demands of those brands at the top of supply chain together in a concerted, worker-driven way to get brands to sign binding agreements with unions. And then there is, worker-driven action happening in communities that matter to those brands, right? I'm in Portland, Oregon. We've got Adidas as our headquarters, and we keep on showing up there. And I think that that's really what we need to be thinking about in this agricultural context as well, is how we can really make our organizing and our accountability structures transnational to match the corporate flow of capital.
Thank you, Avelina, James, and Anna for pointing us forward. What are we going to do given this reality that we're facing? We only have 5 minutes left, and we have some really great questions that have come into through the chat and the Q&A feature. So what I'm going to do is pose two. I'm just going to choose two of these questions for the panelists and give each of you a couple of minutes to speak. You can answer either or both as you'd like. So one question I would love to hear that came in from the audience is, for the export-led agricultural sector, how much responsibility should the foreign buyers and their governments, through legislation, have in ensuring labor rights are respected in the supply chain? So what is the what should the responsibility of foreign buyers and their governments be in situations like what we're seeing in the San Quintín Valley? And then the second question that we'd love to hear from you all about is, if the current mechanisms for remediation and to raise grievances don't work, which we now know, what do you think could operate properly in the fields of San Quintín? So one, responsibility of foreign buyers, and two, if you have any ideas of what could work in terms of grievances and remediation processes in San Quintín. James, I'll start with you, and then we'll move to Evelina and then Anna. Feel free to answer both or one or the other.
Sure, I would say that there's all this legislation on the importation of food products like berries and tomatoes and cucumbers from Mexico to the United States, but they're all in terms of health and safety. So there's been a number of outbreaks of infectious diseases and a number of deaths that have been attributed to products grown in San Quintín in Andrew Williamson's supply chain. And so government reform has said, okay, we need to stop this because we don't want our citizens dying from foodborne illnesses. So what if, we stop thinking of consumers as the ultimate sort of locus of power and start thinking of workers as the ultimate locus of power? We can implement labor policies and tie them to our importation policies in the United States through the USMCA, for example. But to do that, we need strong farm worker and worker organizations that are going to work with politicians and do that kind of politicking. And the other thing in the fields, I think we need a lot of labor organizing. But unfortunately, because the employer protection unions all hold the contracts in Berrymex and Driscoll's, in Milagro de Baja, Andrew Williamson, there's no money for independent worker organizing in places like San Quintín. And so the first thing, we need to get rid of these employer protection contracts and these crony unions. And then if we have a space for worker organizing, if we have a collective bargaining agreement with independent unions like CINCA, there will actually be money to do this kind of organizing, because workers work 8 to 12 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, and the little time they have left over for their families, and then they have to organize to work for better conditions in their workplace. It's a really, really hard situation.
Thank you, James. Evelina, do you have any final comments in response to these questions? So either responsibility of foreign buyers for the abuses that are happening, and or if you have any ideas about grievance mechanisms or remediation that could work in the fields of San Quintín.
Creo que antes de comprar en los supermercados estas frutos rojos, habría que pensarlo muy bien, de dónde vienen y cómo fueron cosechadas esas frutas. Alguien me cuestionaba en algún momento y me decía que si el mundo puede vivir sin frutos rojos. Y la respuesta era sí. Sí podemos vivir sin frutos rojos, porque quien compra estos frutos para nosotros, los trabajadores, es un lujo, es un honor, es algo con mucho valor. Entonces habría que pensarlo muy bien antes de comprarlo y pensar en quiénes lo están sembrando y cosechando y cómo llegaron esos frutos a la tienda y a su mesa. La segunda pregunta, ¿qué mecanismo podría ser útil para resolver los problemas de esclavitud y de trabajo forzoso Para mí, creo que es importante que tanto trabajadores y organizaciones, luchadores sociales, todos pudiéramos trabajar juntos para, de alguna manera, el CINJA lo ha hecho. Nos hemos sentado con agregados laborales del Departamento de Trabajo de su país y a pesar de que no tomaron en cuenta y que no existe un artículo en el TEMEC, nosotros hemos llevado el problema a la mesa y hemos dicho, pues no importa que no lo hayan tomado en cuenta, es un sector muy importante, no solamente porque producimos frutas y verduras para México, Estados Unidos y Canadá, y es parte del sustento de la sociedad. Entonces creo que si trabajamos juntos, podemos exigir la justicia laboral que tanto deseamos que llegue a los que menos tienen y a los que menos pueden. Creo yo que la unidad y el deseo de que se haga justicia se puede presionar. James mencionaba el mecanismo de respuesta rápida que otros sectores han utilizado para resolver problemas o los contratos colectivos. Creo yo que en el futuro, espero que no sea muy lejos, podamos hacer uso de esa herramienta también para nosotros garantizar que las certificadoras dejen de certificar, que los gobiernos garanticen. Por ejemplo, aquí tenemos empresas americanas establecidas aquí, bueno, que cumplan, o sea, que el salario no se compara, como decimos allá, lo que ganamos en 1 hora, aquí lo ganamos en 8 horas o más. Entonces, creo que hay leyes, hay reglas que se pueden implementar, pero no solamente depende de los sindicatos independientes, de los trabajadores, de los abogados como ustedes o de los antropólogos de investigación, sino es un trabajo en unidad. Creo que vamos por buen camino. Yo tengo la esperanza que trabajando juntos podemos lograr.
Thank you, Avelina. In the last minute or two, and I want to give you a chance to respond to either of those questions. So either, what do you see as, what should responsibility of foreign buyers, so these companies who are sourcing these products, or their governments, what responsibility should they take? Or if you have an idea about what grievance mechanisms or means for remediation could be seen in San Quintín.
Wow, yeah, well, I think we're over time, and both of my fellow panelists said this very, very well. But I think, if the question is like an either or, foreign governments or buyers, I think it's both, right? Like there exists a framework that, say what you will about the UN, there is a UN principle or guidance, on business and human rights establishes that companies have a responsibility to prevent abuses, governments have a responsibility to create those conditions, and then that there is a responsibility to remediate those harms from companies. So I think that there exists like a global framework by which this should be followed, and it's not an either or, it is established fact for both.
Thank you so much to our panelists, co-authors, Dr. James Daria and Anna Canning, and Secretary General of CINJA, Avelina Ramirez Ruiz. It was a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us. We've put links to the executive summary in Spanish and English of the report in the chat. The full report is available in English, also putting that in the chat. We'll make this recording available soon. And thank you all for participating in this discussion. We hope to continue it more. Thank you.
Saludos. Bye-bye.